On November 13th, 1960, 5 days after John F. Kennedy won the presidential election, Sammy Davis Jr. married a Swedish blonde actress named May Britt in his home in the Hollywood Hills. The wedding was supposed to be at a synagogue. He'd converted to Judaism 2 years earlier, but the synagogue had received phone calls threatening to burn the building down and murder the rabbi if the ceremony went ahead. So they moved it to Sammy's living room. Under a canopy of white flowers, in front of a small group of guests, Frank Sinatra stood as best man. Peter Lawford, who was married to Kennedy's sister, was the other witness. Both men signed Sammy's marriage certificate. There were armed guards at the front gate. There had been armed guards for months. Since June, when Sammy and May had announced their engagement, the couple had been receiving death threats every single day. Neo-Nazi groups picketed his concerts, waving swastikas, screaming slurs at him from the sidewalks. His hate mail arrived in sacks, not envelopes. Studios that had been booking him for years suddenly stopped answering his calls. Radio stations that had played his records refused to play them anymore. He was, at that moment in 1960, the third highest-earning entertainer in America, a member of the Rat Pack, one of the biggest recording stars in the country. And he was, in 29 states of the Union, breaking the law by marrying the woman he loved. Interracial marriage was still illegal in 31 American states in November of 1960. Loving versus Virginia, the Supreme Court decision that would finally strike those laws down, was still 7 years away. Sammy had done everything he could to make the marriage possible. He'd delayed the wedding by months, at the personal request of the Kennedy campaign, so that his interracial marriage wouldn't cost JFK the Southern vote before the election. He'd campaigned for Kennedy in 20 cities. He'd been booed while singing the national anthem at the Democratic Convention. And once Kennedy won, 3 days before the inauguration, the phone rang at Sammy's house. It was Kennedy's personal secretary, Evelyn Lincoln. She told him he was uninvited. Not from the inauguration itself, from the inaugural gala, the one Frank Sinatra was producing, the one Sammy had been asked to perform at, the one for which he had already had a special suit tailored. Kennedy had won the election by the thinnest margin in modern history, and he needed Southern congressmen, and Southern congressmen did not want to see a black entertainer in the same room as their new president. Kennedy chose the congressman. Sammy was cut. Sammy did not go to the inauguration. He watched it on television with May. This is the story of the marriage that broke every rule in 1960s America. The boy from Harlem who lost an eye and his religion and half of America's love for it. The Swedish actress who gave up her career to stand next to him. The mob threat that had forced him into a fake marriage 2 years earlier. And the 8 years the two of them held it together against a country that would not let them be married in peace. They were, for a moment, the most famous mixed-race couple in the world. And America made them pay for it, every single day. He was born in Harlem on December 8, 1925, on the second floor of a walk-up on 140th Street, and by his 3rd birthday he was already on a vaudeville stage. His father was Sammy Davis Sr., a black dancer from North Carolina who had come north during the Great Migration and found work touring with a troupe of tap and comedy acts called Will Mastin's Holiday in Dixieland. His mother was Elvira Sanchez, sometimes described as Puerto Rican and sometimes as Cuban, a chorus girl in the same troupe. They had met on the road. They had married quickly. And when Elvira got pregnant with Sammy, she kept working until she couldn't hide it anymore, then went home to Harlem to have the baby with Sammy Sr.'s mother, a stern woman everyone called Rosa B., who would end up raising the boy for his earliest years. The marriage did not last. Elvira left when Sammy was about 2.5. She went back to the touring circuit, back to chorus work, and eventually to a second life he would not become close to for decades. Sammy Sr. got custody. He was, in the plainest sense, a working dancer who could not afford a babysitter. So when Sammy was 3, his father made a decision that would define the rest of his son's life. Instead of leaving the boy behind in Harlem, he put him in the act. The Will Mastin Trio, as the troupe would eventually be called, made a little boy the centerpiece of its comedy. Sammy could tap almost as soon as he could walk. His father and Will Mastin, the older bandleader who ran the show and whom Sammy would call his godfather for the rest of his life, taught him routines by having him watch them do the routines and then imitate them. He picked it up faster than either of them expected. By 4, he was doing full numbers on stage, in tiny tailored tuxedos, in front of audiences who could not believe what they were seeing. By 7, he was in a Hollywood short called Rufus Jones for President, playing a black boy who dreams he becomes President of the United States. He would remember, decades later, singing a song called I'm a Wigger Boy from Georgia in that film. The joke of it, if you can call it a joke, was the racial impossibility of a black child in the White House. It would be another 80 years before that actually happened. The other thing his father and Will Mastin did, which Sammy did not fully understand until much later, was hide America from him. They were performing all over the country in the 1930s, including the segregated South, and the boy who was making audiences laugh every night was also, everywhere they went, sleeping in black-only hotels, entering theaters through back doors, eating in kitchens instead of dining rooms, and using bathrooms with signs on them he was still too young to read. His father and Mastin absorbed every insult for him. When a hotel turned them away, they told Sammy the place was full. When a restaurant refused to serve them, they told Sammy they didn't feel like eating there. When a promoter made them enter through the alley, they told Sammy that was the special door for the stars. Every slight, every closed door, every ugly moment of American racial life in the 1930s was rewritten for the boy in the middle as something else, something logistical, something incidental, so he could keep his energy up and his smile on and his dance clean. He believed them, mostly, because he was a child, and he grew up on the road as one of the strangest children in America, fatherless in a real sense despite living with his father every day, motherless despite still having one, without any formal education past the 2nd grade, without any friends his own age for years at a time, without a church or a school or a neighborhood, but with a stage every single night, and 2 men who worshipped him and worked him. He learned to read by studying the newspapers Sammy Sr. brought back to the hotel room. He learned math by counting box office receipts. He learned to sing by listening to Al Jolson and Bill Robinson records on the road and imitating them until his father laughed. He was, by his early teens, one of the best young tap dancers in America, and almost nobody knew his real name because the act was always billed as the Will Mastin Trio. Then, in 1943, the army came for him. He was 17 years old and had never lived a single day of his life outside the protective bubble his father and Mastin had built for him. He was drafted, sent to Fort Warren in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and put in an integrated barracks. That last word, integrated, was the pivot on which his life turned. Because integration in 1943 America did not mean black and white soldiers living peacefully alongside each other. It meant a black boy who had been fed a story about America his entire life, being suddenly locked in a room with white boys who had been fed a completely different story about him. He was beaten, repeatedly. His nose was broken twice. He was thrown headfirst into a urinal by white recruits. He was called every slur that existed in the American vocabulary. His name was scratched off his cot with the word coon written in its place. His arm was painted white overnight by his own bunkmates as a joke while he slept. He fought back every time, with his fists, sometimes winning, sometimes losing badly. He was a small man, 5'5" and thin, and the men attacking him were bigger. He did not stop fighting. Later, he described what those 2 years did to him with a single sentence that has been quoted in every biography since. Overnight, the world looked different. The thing his father and Mastin had spent 17 years hiding from him hit him in the face all at once, in a Wyoming barracks at 18 years old. And it changed him in a way that never fully wore off. He decided, in that barracks, that if the world would not respect him for being a man, it would respect him for being a genius. He would become so good, so undeniable on a stage, that no white American could pretend not to see him. He was eventually transferred to an integrated entertainment unit, where he found something surprising. On a stage, in front of a crowd of soldiers, the same men who would have beaten him in the barracks laughed and clapped for him. That gap between the man in uniform and the man in the spotlight would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would spend the rest of his career trying to close it, and closing it, mostly, only inside the theatre walls. When the war ended and he was discharged, he went straight back to the Will Mastin trio. He was 20 years old, angrier than he had ever been, more focused than he had ever been, and about to become one of the most electrifying live performers America had ever seen. The trio started climbing. Bigger clubs, better bookings, a slot opening for Mickey Rooney, who told Sammy his impressions were so good he should put them in the act. Sammy did. And by 1951, opening for Janice Page at Ciro's in Los Angeles the night of the Academy Awards, Sammy Davis Jr. finally had the moment that made him famous. Every star in Hollywood was in the room. He took the stage last, when they were tired and half drunk and ready to go home. He did his impressions, then his dancing, then his singing, and he did not let them leave. Judy Garland stood up. Humphrey Bogart stood up. Frank Sinatra, who had never met him before, stood up and applauded until his hands hurt. Sammy Davis Jr. was 25 years old, and Hollywood had just noticed him. The next thing that would happen to him, at the very peak of his climb, was about to almost kill him. The car crash happened at dawn on November 19, 1954, on a highway between Las Vegas and Los Angeles. Sammy Davis Jr. was 28 years old, one of the fastest-rising nightclub acts in America, and he had just wrapped a run at the New Frontier in Vegas. He was driving back to Los Angeles that morning to record a song for his first solo album at Decca Records. It was scheduled for that afternoon. He was in a hurry. He was driving a rented white Cadillac convertible on Highway 91, near the town of San Bernardino. There was a woman with him and a friend in the back seat. It was still dark. Ahead of him, an elderly couple in a Cadillac made a slow U-turn on the highway, blocking both lanes. Sammy saw the car too late. He hit the brakes and swerved, but the front of the Cadillac caught the side of the other vehicle at highway speed. The steering wheel struck him in the face. The center bullhorn on the wheel, a chrome ornament shaped like a bullet, drove into his left eye and destroyed it on impact. He was thrown against the dashboard, then back into the seat. Blood ran into his good eye. He could feel something wrong with his face, but did not yet understand what. The passengers in his car survived with minor injuries. Sammy was taken to a small hospital in San Bernardino, where a doctor confirmed what everyone in the emergency room had already guessed. His left eye was gone. He would spend the rest of his life wearing a glass one. He was in the hospital for weeks. Frank Sinatra flew in from Los Angeles to sit at his bedside. Jerry Lewis called every day. Cary Grant came by. Milton Berle brought him jokes. And in the middle of all of it, Sammy Davis Jr., a 28-year-old black entertainer who had built his entire life on being seen, was lying in a hospital bed, with his face wrapped in bandages, wondering if he would ever perform again. He also made a decision, in that hospital room, that would follow him for the rest of his life. A rabbi named Max Nussbaum came to see him. Sammy had been friendly with a few Jewish performers on the Vegas circuit and had asked, once, about the religion out of curiosity. Nussbaum, called in as a comfort visit, spent hours with him. They talked about suffering, about persecution, about being outsiders in a country that would not fully accept you. Sammy told him, later, that he saw something in the story of Jewish history he recognized from his own. The Jews had been enslaved. The Jews had been chased. The Jews had held on to themselves anyway. It gave him something to hold on to, too. He would formally convert to Judaism a few years later, in 1961, but the choice was made, in some real sense, in that San Bernardino hospital. When he came out, wearing a black eye patch that would become an early trademark before he switched to a glass eye, he did what everyone assumed he could not do. He went back on stage. Within 2 months, he performed at Ciro's again in Los Angeles. Opening night, sold out, and the audience gave him a standing ovation before he had sung a note. His act was, if anything, sharper than before. He'd lost depth perception and had to relearn certain tap combinations, but he did the work. He was, within a year of losing the eye, a bigger star than he had been before. He got his first Broadway show in 1956, a musical called Mr. Wonderful, that was built around him. It ran for nearly 400 performances. He recorded singles, he toured. He landed a nightly headline slot at the New Frontier in Las Vegas that ran, off and on, for years. The catch, and there was always a catch for a black entertainer in the 1950s American Southwest, was that he could not sleep in the hotel where he performed. He could not gamble at its tables. He could not eat in its restaurant. He came in through the service entrance every night, went on stage, killed the audience for an hour, and then was driven off the property to sleep in a boarding house on the black side of town. He would eventually force those rules to change. In a few years, he would refuse to perform anywhere that would not let him stay, and Vegas would quietly, grudgingly, integrate its casinos partly because he made them. But in 1956, he was still playing by the rules, still smiling through them, still absorbing the humiliation as the price of the ticket. Then, in the summer of 1958, Frank Sinatra pulled him fully into the Rat Pack. They had been friends since the Ciro's night in 1951. Sinatra was, in his awkward and grand way, one of the few white stars in Hollywood who did not carry the racism of his era. He integrated his crowds. He refused to play rooms where Sammy couldn't stay. He publicly punched a hotel clerk in Vegas, once, for using a slur about Sammy. The Rat Pack, when it coalesced around Sinatra in the late 1950s, with Dean Martin and Peter Lawford and Joey Bishop, made Sammy its fifth member and the smallest star in the group only in physical size. Their Vegas shows became legend. Their movie Ocean's 11 was shot during those shows in 1960, with the five of them filming during the day and performing at the Sands at night. Sammy Davis Jr., who had been beaten in a Wyoming barracks 15 years earlier for being black, was now the third highest-earning entertainer in America, standing on stage in Las Vegas nightly next to the most famous white singer alive. He had also, by that point, already gone through the worst private scandal of his career. It had happened 2 years earlier, in 1957, and it had ended with a mob threat and a marriage to a woman he did not love. Her name was Kim Novak, and the man who wanted Sammy dead over her was named Harry Cohn. Kim Novak was, in 1957, the biggest female box office draw in America. She was blonde, cool, 24 years old, and Columbia Pictures had spent 4 years building her into their answer to Marilyn Monroe. She had just filmed Pal Joey with Frank Sinatra and would soon be shooting Vertigo with Hitchcock. Her contract with Columbia was one of the most valuable in Hollywood, and Columbia was run by a man named Harry Cohn, who was, by nearly universal agreement in the industry, the most feared executive of his generation. Cohn kept a framed photograph of Benito Mussolini on his desk. He carried a riding crop and slashed it across furniture to intimidate people. He wore a matching friendship ring with the Chicago mobster Johnny Roselli, and he considered Kim Novak, in the plainest possible language, his property. Sammy Davis Jr. met her at a party at Tony Curtis's house in the fall of 1957. He was 31, wearing a tuxedo, freshly divorced from a first quiet marriage that had barely lasted, single, and by that point, unquestionably one of the most electrifying men in a room in Hollywood. She noticed him. He noticed her. They started talking. According to Novak's own account, decades later, they connected almost immediately over the shared experience of being outsiders in the same industry. She was a Slovak coal miner's daughter from Chicago who had been rebranded and repackaged by Columbia into a fantasy blonde. He was a black entertainer performing for white audiences in venues where he could not eat. Both of them, on some level, understood what it felt like to be watched constantly by a world that would never quite see them. They started meeting in secret. Sammy would hide under a blanket in the back seat of a car to slip past studio spies. He rented a beach house in Malibu where they could be alone. She invited him to her house for spaghetti dinners. Whether the relationship was fully physical Or, as Novak insisted for the rest of her life, more of a passionate friendship is something only the two of them ever really knew. What is not in dispute is that they were in love with each other, in some form, for most of that year. The gossip columnist Dorothy Kilgallen was the first to hint at it in print. She used only the initials KN and SD, but every reader in Hollywood knew what she meant. Then Irv Kupcinet of the Chicago Sun-Times added more detail. Then the London Daily Mirror ran the headline, "Kim Novak is about to become engaged to Sammy Davis Jr. and Hollywood is aghast." Harry Cohn read those items and lost his mind. By multiple accounts, Cohn was in the middle of a series of small heart attacks by early 1958 and was in bad shape physically. The news that his most valuable star, the woman he considered his creation, was involved with a black entertainer sent him over the edge. He was, according to his employees, apoplectic. He is quoted in more than one biography as saying he would rather see her dead than see her marry a black man. And Cohn, who had grown up around Chicago mob figures and kept those connections all the way through his rise in Hollywood, did what Cohn did. He picked up the phone and made a call. The threat came for Sammy through his father. Mickey Cohen, the notorious Los Angeles mobster, went to see Sammy Davis Sr. and told him, in the plainest language, that a contract had been placed on his son from Chicago. It was not a hit contract exactly. What Cohen described was worse in a certain way. The order, he said, was to break both of Sammy's legs and put out his other eye. Cohen said he was giving Sammy 24 hours to make it go away. And there was only one way to make it go away, according to Cohen. Sammy had to marry a black woman, publicly, fast, enough to kill the Kim Novak story dead. Sammy Sr. drove to his son and told him. Sammy called a few people, including some of his own organized crime connections in New York, hoping to negotiate. There was nothing to negotiate. The Chicago order stood. He gave up. He called a young black singer named Lorraine White. He had dated her briefly, a few years earlier. He met her at a Sunset Strip nightclub the same night, sat her down, and made her the strangest proposal in Hollywood history. He offered her a lump sum of cash, somewhere between $10,000 and $25,000 depending on which account you believe, to marry him for 1 year. She would have all the legal rights and public status of Mrs. Sammy Davis Jr., and at the end of the year, they would quietly divorce. She said yes. On January 10, 1958, Sammy Davis Jr. married Lorraine White at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. Harry Belafonte was best man. Sammy was visibly drunk during the ceremony. He had been drinking for days. Photographs from the reception show him with a wide, forced smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes. Kim Novak, who read about the wedding in the newspaper, sent no congratulations. A month later, on February 27, 1958, Harry Cohn had a final heart attack in the back of an ambulance on his way to a Phoenix hospital. He died before he arrived. The mob threat effectively died with him. Sammy's marriage to Lorraine White dissolved within months. They lived under the same roof for a stretch, tried to make it look real for the columnists, and then quietly stopped bothering. By September 1958, they had filed for divorce. It was finalized the following spring. Lorraine took the money and largely disappeared from the public record. Sammy Davis Jr. was a free man again. He was also, in every private conversation he had for the rest of his life, changed by what had happened. He had been threatened into marriage by the American mafia because he had fallen in love with a white woman. He had watched a national industry decide his love life for him, backed by violence. The next time he fell in love with a white woman, he was not going to let anyone tell him no. Her name would be May Britt. May Britt was born Marge Britt Wilkins on March 22, 1934, on the island of Lidingö, just outside Stockholm. Her father was an accountant. Her family was ordinary Swedish middle class, and she had no plans, growing up, to become a movie star. She was working as a photographer's assistant in Stockholm in 1952, 18 years old, tall and blonde and quiet, when the Italian filmmakers Carlo Ponti and Mario Soldati happened to walk into the studio to look at portfolios. Ponti, who would soon marry Sophia Loren, saw May and stopped. He told her, in the direct Italian way, that she was going to be a movie star. She thought he was joking. He was not. Within 6 months she was in Rome, shooting Italian films. She learned Italian on set. She learned French. She was cast in War and Peace in 1956, opposite Audrey Hepburn and Henry Fonda. She was in The Hunters with Robert Mitchum. And in 1959 she was brought to Hollywood by 20th Century Fox to star in a remake of the classic German film The Blue Angel, playing the role Marlene Dietrich had made famous. She was 25 years old. Fox had big plans for her. They billed her as the next Garbo. She met Sammy Davis Jr. that same year. The circumstances have been told in different versions, but the most consistent one, told by their daughter Tracy in her memoir, is that May went to see Sammy perform at a Los Angeles nightclub and was invited backstage afterward by mutual friends. She had heard of him, but had never really watched him perform before. What she saw that night stunned her. She said later that she had never seen anyone command a stage the way he did. He noticed her too. He invited her to a party at his house later that week. She went. The attraction was immediate and quiet, the opposite of the Kim-Novak affair in almost every way. Where Novak had been chaotic and secretive and full of hiding under blankets in cars, May Britt from the very beginning met Sammy Davis Jr. openly. She did not care who saw them together. She did not care what her studio thought. She was Swedish. She had grown up in a country where the racial anxieties of America simply did not exist in the same way. She looked at Sammy and saw a man she liked. That was, to her, the entire story. They started dating in late 1959. By early 1960 they were serious, and in June of 1960, at Sammy's insistence, they announced their engagement to the press. The reaction, within 24 hours, was volcanic. The hate mail arrived at Sammy's house, not in envelopes but in sacks. His office was flooded with phone calls. Neo-Nazi groups picketed his concerts, waving swastikas and Confederate flags, screaming slurs at him from the sidewalks in front of the theaters. Death threats came in daily, some of them detailed enough to be taken seriously by the police. May Britt's studio, 20th Century Fox, quietly began pulling back from her. The Blue Angel had underperformed at the box office. She was in the middle of shooting a film called Murder, Inc., but the roles that had been in her pipeline started to dry up. Fox executives told her, in careful language, that a mixed-race marriage was not something American audiences were going to accept from a starlet the studio was trying to sell as a leading lady. She said she did not care, and she meant it. Sammy hired armed security for both of them. The bodyguards went with them everywhere. Their houses had guards at the gates 24 hours a day. May, who had never lived with any of this kind of pressure in Sweden or Italy, absorbed it with a calm that stunned everyone who knew her. She simply refused to let it change her mind. She was going to marry Sammy Davis Jr., and America could catch up or not. The Kennedy problem started that same summer. Sammy was a Democrat. He had campaigned hard for John F. Kennedy through the 1960 primaries and into the general election. He had performed at rallies in 20 cities. He had raised money. He had helped register voters. He was, in the plainest sense, one of the most valuable black surrogates the Kennedy campaign had. And the Kennedy campaign, which had a difficult calculation to make about the segregated South, decided that Sammy's interracial marriage was a political problem they needed to manage. According to what Sammy would tell his daughter Tracy years later, the request came through Frank Sinatra, who was personally close to Kennedy through Peter Lawford. The message was direct. Would Sammy consider delaying his wedding until after the November election? An interracial wedding in October, splashed across every front page in the country, might cost Kennedy the South. And the South, in that election, was going to be close. Sammy talked to May. Both of them understood what was being asked. Both of them agreed. The wedding was pushed to November 13th, 5 days after Kennedy won the presidency, by one of the thinnest margins in American history. Sammy had done everything the campaign had asked of him. 3 days before the inauguration in January of 1961, The phone rang at Sammy's house. It was Evelyn Lincoln, Kennedy's personal secretary. She told Sammy, in polite, careful language, that the president had decided it would be best if Sammy did not attend the inaugural gala after all. Southern congressmen were making it a problem. Sammy was uninvited. He had already had a special suit made. May had bought a Balenciaga gown for the evening. They watched the inauguration on television at home, in silence. The message from the country, from top to bottom, could not have been clearer. The wedding itself was supposed to happen at Temple Israel of Hollywood, the Reform synagogue where Sammy had been welcomed as a convert 2 years earlier. He had wanted a Jewish ceremony. He had wanted the rabbi who had come to his hospital bed in 1954 to marry him. He had wanted the community he had chosen for himself to witness the marriage, and the temple had, in the first phone calls, agreed. But then the threats started. The synagogue received calls, day after day, from men promising to burn the building down if the wedding went ahead. Some of the threats named the rabbi specifically, warning what would happen to him personally. The FBI, which was already monitoring the couple's mail for federal threats, told the temple's leadership that the calls had to be taken seriously. In late October, 3 weeks before the ceremony, the synagogue quietly withdrew as the venue. They apologized. They said they could not risk the congregation. Sammy did not fight it. He understood. The wedding was moved to his own house in the Hollywood Hills, a large, modernist property on Evanview Drive, with a security wall around the grounds and armed guards at the gate. On November 13, 1960, at 3 in the afternoon, roughly 70 guests gathered in Sammy Davis Jr.'s living room. A canopy of white flowers had been set up in front of the fireplace. Rabbi William Kramer, from Temple Israel, agreed to perform the ceremony privately in the home. Frank Sinatra stood as best man. Peter Lawford stood as second witness. Both men signed the marriage certificate. May, 26 years old, wore a simple pale grey dress. Sammy, 34, wore a dark suit and his black eye patch. He would switch to a glass eye only later that decade. Outside the gates of the house, a small group of picketers stood with signs. The signs said things that cannot be printed here. Police kept them back from the driveway. The wedding photos, when they were released to the press the next day, showed a smiling couple under white flowers surrounded by Rat Pack royalty. What they did not show was that every single person entering the property had passed through a security check, and that armed guards were stationed at 3 points inside the house itself during the ceremony. The reception went on into the night. Sinatra sang. Dean Martin was there. There were toasts. There was laughter. There was, for a few hours, the illusion of an ordinary Hollywood wedding. Then Sammy and May left for their honeymoon in Northern California, and the illusion ended. The next 8 years were the marriage inside the storm. They lived, from the day they came home from the honeymoon, with round-the-clock private security. Their mail was screened. Their phones were tapped, sometimes by threat monitoring agencies working with the FBI. Sometimes, they suspected, by less friendly parties. Their daughter Tracy was born in July of 1961, 8 months after the wedding. Their son Mark, adopted, followed in 1963. Their second son Jeff, also adopted, followed in 1965. 3 children, in 5 years, into a household where the parents could not go out for dinner without a bodyguard. May, who had been the biggest emerging star at Fox before the marriage, walked away from her career almost immediately. The studio did not want her anymore. Roles stopped coming. The scripts that did arrive were smaller, thinner, offered only to see if she might take them at reduced money. She said no to all of them. She did one more picture in 1962, a comedy called Secret of Deep Harbor, and then she stopped. She would not appear in another film for nearly a decade. She stayed home. She raised the children. She was, in her own quiet Swedish way, doing exactly what she had decided at the start, refusing to let America pick her fights for her. Sammy did not stop. He worked constantly. He had to. The couple's expenses were enormous, from the security to the household to the 3 children, and Sammy's spending habits were, by his own admission later, out of control. He was making major money on the Vegas circuit and losing much of it back at the tables between shows. He was buying gifts, houses, cars, jewelry, on impulse. He was drinking more than he had before the marriage. He was starting to use cocaine. He was also, in the ways that Rat Pack husbands of that generation often were, unfaithful. There were affairs. There were nights he did not come home. May knew about some of them, suspected the rest, and absorbed it the way she absorbed the threats. Quietly, without theatrics, without complaint that reached the outside world. She also, quietly, began to lose her husband to a life she could not follow him into. Sammy's civil rights activism, which had been genuine and growing since the mid-1950s, took him deeper into politics through the 1960s. He marched with Martin Luther King in Selma in 1965. He raised money for Senelk. He was at the March on Washington in 1963. He was one of the most visible black entertainers in America, publicly aligned with the civil rights movement. And that visibility took him away from home for weeks at a time, and put him under a different kind of pressure, one that came from inside the black community as much as from outside it. Because Sammy, married to a white Swedish woman, was viewed by some black activists as a symbol they were not sure they wanted. His marriage was, to some, a kind of statement. To others, it was a betrayal. He absorbed the criticism from both sides for 8 years. By early 1968, according to their daughter Tracy, the strain was starting to break him. He was drinking too much. He was gone too often. May, at 34, had spent nearly a decade of her life inside a walled compound raising 3 children, while her husband worked the road, and she had stopped waiting for the pressure to lift. That summer, she asked for a separation. Sammy did not fight it. The divorce was filed in December of 1968, and finalized quietly the following year. There was no big scandal, no press conference, no bitter statements. May got custody of the 3 children. Sammy kept visitation. They agreed to raise the kids together, as much as the schedule allowed, and by every account of everyone involved, they mostly did. May Britt walked out of the marriage the way she had walked into it, without complaint. She had loved Sammy Davis Jr. She had given up her career for him. She had raised 3 children with him. And now, at 34, she was going home to a quieter life. She moved out of Los Angeles eventually, remarried in 1993, to a man named Lennart Ringqvist, and lived the rest of her days almost entirely out of the public eye. She rarely gave interviews. She almost never spoke publicly about Sammy, and when she did, it was with warmth and without regret. She would say, in the few conversations she gave to reporters over the decades, that the marriage had been hard, that America had been hard, and that she had loved him. Sammy did not have the same soft landing. The years right after the divorce were, by his own later account, the worst of his life. He was drinking heavily. He was using cocaine. He was gambling more than he could afford. He was performing constantly to pay for all of it, in Vegas mostly, but also in Reno, in Atlantic City, in every venue that would book him for the money he needed. His health began to deteriorate. His 3rd marriage, in 1970, to a black dancer named Altovise Gore, would last technically until his death, but was itself a difficult arrangement, both of them struggling with their own addictions. And then, in July of 1972, Sammy Davis Jr. did the single most damaging thing he ever did to his public image in Black America. He hugged Richard Nixon. The Republican National Convention was being held that summer in Miami Beach. Nixon was running for re-election, and Sammy, whose politics had been drifting to the right through the late 1960s, disillusioned with the Kennedy family and disappointed by what he saw as broken promises from the Democratic Party, had accepted an invitation to perform at the convention. It was a small controversy on its own. What made it a large one was what happened at a youth rally afterward, when Sammy walked up behind Nixon on stage and, on a spontaneous impulse, wrapped his arms around him from behind in a full embrace. The photograph ran on the front page of every newspaper in the country. Black America was furious. The hug, for Nixon, was a political gift beyond measure. For Sammy, it was a catastrophe. Civil rights leaders publicly rebuked him. Black entertainers he had considered friends stopped taking his calls. Jesse Jackson, who had once introduced Sammy on stage as a hero of the movement, did not speak to him for years afterward. Sammy tried to explain that the hug had been affectionate, not political, that he still supported civil rights, that he had been trying to bridge a divide. Nobody was listening. He was, for the rest of the 1970s, a smaller figure in American cultural life than he had been in the 1960s. He still packed rooms. He was still on television. He had a huge hit in 1972 with a novelty song called The Candy Man, which he hated singing, but which stayed at #1 for 3 weeks, and became, ironically, the song most Americans identified him with. But he was no longer at the center of anything the way he once had been. The Rat Pack had faded. The civil rights movement had passed him by. Vegas was changing. He was in his 50s, still working, still spending, still self-destructing quietly. In the 1980s, he cleaned up, mostly. He got serious about paying down his enormous tax debts, which had ballooned into the millions of dollars. He did the road again. He did a farewell tour with Sinatra and Dean Martin in 1988, which turned into a series of health problems for Dean and was cut short. He did television specials. He wrote a second autobiography. Then, in 1989, doctors found a tumor at the base of his throat. Sammy Davis Jr., a lifelong chain smoker, had laryngeal cancer. He was told the standard treatment would be surgery to remove his larynx, which would end his career as a singer. He refused. He chose chemotherapy and radiation instead, hoping to save his voice. The cancer came back. By early 1990, it was terminal. May Britt was one of the people who came to see him. She flew to Los Angeles when she heard how bad it was. She had not been in his house in over 20 years. She sat with him at his bedside. Their children, Tracy and Mark and Jeff, were there. Sammy, by that point, could barely speak. What passed between him and May in that room has never been publicly disclosed. Their daughter Tracy later wrote only that her mother and her father made their peace, quietly, in his final weeks, and that both of them cried. Sammy Davis Jr. died on May 16, 1990, at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 64 years old. The lights on the Las Vegas Strip were dimmed for 10 minutes that night in his honor, the first time the city had done that for any performer since the Strip was built. Frank Sinatra gave the eulogy at his funeral. Jesse Jackson, who had not spoken to Sammy for 20 years after the Nixon hug, came to pay his respects. May Britt was in the front row. She outlived him by 35 years. May Britt walked out of Sammy Davis Jr.'s funeral in May of 1990 and, as she had done for 2 decades already, disappeared quietly back into her private life. She was 56 years old. She had a second marriage in her future, a quiet Northern California existence, 3 grown children, and no interest whatsoever in becoming a talking head about the man she had been married to. She would live for another 35 years, and in all of them she granted a total of perhaps a dozen interviews. What she said, in the ones she gave, was consistent. She had loved him. She had known what she was walking into, and had walked into it anyway. She did not regret it. She did not regret the career she gave up. She did not regret the 8 years inside the security fence. She said, in a rare 2010 conversation, that whatever people wanted to say about the pressure and the threats and the price, she had married the man she wanted to marry, and America had been the one with the problem, not her. She died on December 11, 2025, of natural causes, at Providence Cedars Sinai Tarzana Medical Center in Los Angeles. She was 91 years old. Her son Mark, the middle child from her marriage to Sammy, announced her death to the Hollywood Reporter. She was survived by all 3 of her children. The obituaries that ran that week said the thing everyone had always said about her, that she was the Swedish actress who had walked away from a Hollywood career because she had married a black entertainer in 1960 America, and that the American entertainment industry, watching her do it, had punished her for it, and then, when she refused to be broken by the punishment, had lost interest and moved on. They also said the other thing, the one that stayed true from the day of the wedding to the day she died, that the marriage had, in its own quiet way, moved the country, not fast, not by itself, but when Loving versus Virginia struck down the last of the anti-miscegenation laws in June of 1967, 7 years after Sammy and May had married in a house because a synagogue was afraid to host them, the Supreme Court was ratifying something that a small number of American couples had already been living openly for years. Sammy and May had been the most visible of them. Their marriage had put a face on a legal fight that could otherwise have felt abstract. Every white American who watched them on television, every black American who watched them on television, every young couple who watched them and understood that what they wanted was, for the moment, still illegal in most of the country, was pushed slightly closer, week by week, to the position the Supreme Court would eventually take. That is a heavy thing to ask of a marriage. Sammy and May did not sign up for it exactly. They fell in love, in Sweden's terms, in a Los Angeles nightclub, and then found themselves inside a national argument they had never asked to have. Look at the whole shape of it. A boy dancing on a vaudeville stage at 3 years old, protected from America by a father and a godfather who lied to him about hotel doors. An army barracks in Wyoming, where the world he'd been protected from finally arrived, and broke his nose twice, and painted his arm white. A steering wheel that took his eye. A rabbi who gave him back his soul. A Chicago mob threat over a blonde starlet and a fake marriage arranged in 24 hours to save his own legs. A Swedish woman who did not care what America thought. A synagogue that could not risk hosting the wedding. A president who accepted his help and then closed the door in his face. 8 years inside a security wall. A hug that cost him half his people. A cancer that took his voice. A wife who came home to say goodbye. Sammy Davis Jr. died on May 16, 1990. Frank Sinatra died in 1998. Peter Lawford died in 1984. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. Kim Novak lived on, in a Pacific Northwest home she rarely left, giving interviews about him only when she was pushed. Lorraine White, who had married him for the money in 1958, quietly outlived him and rarely spoke of him again. May Britt was the last of the women in his life to go. He had been many things over 64 years. The kid in the middle of the Will Mastin trio, the star who lost an eye and came back stronger, the Rat Pack member with a glass eye and a Yiddish blessing at his wedding, the most famous mixed-race marriage in America, the man who hugged Nixon, the Candy Man, the friend of Sinatra, the father of Tracy and Mark and Jeff. Underneath all of it, from Harlem to Cheyenne to Vegas to the Hollywood Hills, he was a man who had spent his entire life trying to be seen, really seen. Not as a black man on a stage, not as a Rat Pack sidekick, not as a controversy, not as a photograph, as himself. May Britt had seen him. For 8 years, in a house behind a security wall, with 3 children and no career of her own, she had seen him. That was the marriage America could not stand. And it was the marriage that made the country, slowly, look at itself. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.